Hey, what's going on, y'all? This is State Representative Brandon McGee. I am back again. So glad that each and every one of you have joined us yet another week to just be a part of our crew, our team here at the Inside the Room podcast. Once again, thank you for joining us Inside the Room, where we discuss politics, leadership, and culture. As the world witnessed the closing arguments to the most critical trial of this year, we anxiously await the verdict that will consider whether Chauvin's case of force exceeded what was necessary to make the arrest, constituting murder or manslaughter of our beloved George Floyd. So inside the room, we will dedicate this podcast episode to discuss the trial, obviously the systemic inequities that persist throughout our country and even in the system, if you would. As always, as we seek to provide our listeners with some legal perspective regarding these proceedings, today I am so honored to be joined by my special guest, Yale Law Associate Professor of Law and Associate Professor of Sociology, Dr. Monica Bell. I hope I didn't mess that up, Dr. Bell. Those are your titles. I love when we have a sister, and yes, she's black, all black. And I'm so honored that she is inside the room with us today. So again, join me in gathering people from all walks of life to step inside the room to learn how we can together educate and uplift our communities. So I'd love to do a quick recap of the final week leading up to deliberations, but I have a law professor, and before I actually just give her some space to kind of talk a little bit about her work, I want to jump right into sort of some questions. I told her this is like, we're sitting around the kitchen table and we are talking about what's happening throughout this country, specifically on this particular case. But again, today we have Dr. Monica Bell. She is down at Yale University. Before joining Yale Law School faculty, Dr. Bell was a Clemenceau Fellow and a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She previously served as a Lehman or a Lyman Fellow. Did I say that correctly?
Lyman, yeah.
Lyman Fellow at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, where she worked on equitable provision of services to underprivileged and underrepresented populations. Her resume goes on and on, y'all. She clerked for the Honorable Cameron McGovern Curry of the U.S. District Court for South Carolina. She's a first generation college graduate from upstate South Carolina. My roots go down to Alabama. Dr. Bell holds degrees from Furman University, Truman Scholar, University College Dublin, Mitchell Scholar, Yale Law School, and Harvard University. And in 2019, Dr. Bell received the Yale Law Women Faculty Excellence Award on a vote of the Yale Law School student body. In 2021, 2022, Dr. Bell will be a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. I am just honored to be in the same space with you. And I know people don't like this. It makes them very uncomfortable, but it's an honor. And I wish, I had you on last month with the rest of the women that I honored. So you're going to be one of my honorary recipients of just celebrating Black women and all that you do. So I quickly want to jump in, Dr. Bell. Tell the people who you are and what's going on in the work that you continue to do, and then we can quickly jump into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Representative McGee, I just want to thank you for the work you do for the state of Connecticut and for our people and for doing this podcast. It's just so important to have that work being done, this educational and discussion, dialogue building work. So in terms of my own work, I have I've long just been interested in like the experiences of Black people in systems of justice and systems of law. That's been my primary concern since I was a child. And so I do a lot of work in terms of interviewing people and spending time in Black communities, asking people about their experiences, and then putting that in conversation with work in sociology, law, kind of pre-existing law. So one of the main things I've been working on for almost a decade now has been policing, and specifically how Black people in cities in particular experience the police. And I come at that not being so interested in, the constitutional law of policing. I'm much more interested in the experiences and how law writ large. So sometimes I write about housing law, sometimes I write about policing policy, police departmental policy, how all of these types of law that exist could better constrain the effects, the harsh effects of policing on Black communities. So that's where most of my work has been focused.
So, sort of backing into the trial, and I want to take you back to March of 2020. And if you watch the video, I have not, I can't. And even when I talk about it, I get a little choked up because I read the transcript, and it was just as vivid as the video, as people described to me. What were your initial reactions when you saw that video or read the transcript? What were you thinking?
Right. So when Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, it was May 25th, 2020. And I probably didn't actually watch the video until about a month later. Now, I was reading a lot of things about the video, but like you, I guess, especially being someone who focuses on policing in my academic work, it can be a lot easier to talk about these issues in kind of detached terms when one hasn't seen the footage. And that's really what I was doing. Like, I was talking a lot about what I know about police violence against Black people. So when I finally watched the video, I didn't learn anything new from it. And I think a lot of people feel this way, what stands out the most, at least for me in watching the video, is seeing like one of my brothers really be like his life being taken from him, and the just complete disregard for his life, like the complete, he's crying out for his mother who he loved. He's saying, read, and Derek Chauvin is just totally uninterested in this. And, I was watching the closing arguments and, seeing the officer kind of pick stones out of the tires of the car while taking George Floyd's life. And so my reaction was just, I wish this were more surprising. It is shocking, it is painful, but it is not surprising.
It's very interesting to see some of the Instagram posts, and one recently that I saw was just text, not a picture, and it said, and I'm paraphrasing, the difference between Rodney King and George Floyd is that it was live and in color, and it's sad that there is not a difference, because Rodney King was in color as well. And he was literally killed in front of the world to see. And thankfully, we have these smartphones that was able to capture those 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd with that knee on his neck. So as a law professor and understanding how all of this work, could you help us, as just sort of the lay folk that's watching this, and we're emotionally driven, all we know is this man killed that Black man. I don't know all the in-betweens and whether or not his lungs were too big and all this other stuff. Like, break it down for the folks who are listening to us right now to understand where we are and the significance. And first of all, Chauvin invoking his Fifth Amendment right not to testify, and his attorneys now pivoting and blaming Congressman Waters for her commentary, and the judge. Just help us unpack all of that, because I know I'm kind of bouncing around, but if you can, in your teacher professional type way, help us to understand this, that would be appreciated.
Yeah. So one thing I just think is helpful to clarify that has been, a fact that has been key to the trial is that, originally we talked about 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but now we're in the 9 minutes and 29 seconds world. There was a whole amount of time that Officer Chauvin destroyed George Floyd. Lack of better language. But so what's going on in the trial? So first, it's important to understand, and I think most people have a sense of this, is that it's extremely difficult to effectively prosecute and get a conviction of an officer who's working in the line of duty, which is, as a descriptive matter, Derek Chauvin was on duty and was responding to a call about this counterfeit $20 bill or whatever. And he and his officers were the ones assigned to the area. So it's very difficult to get convictions for a few different reasons. But in general, the main one is that, well, I guess there are a few. So first is that in general, courts don't want to prosecute officers who are, they generally want to defer to officers' expertise about when they're in danger. Now, the standard for when an officer can be held liable for action often has to do with the objective reasonableness of the action. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean, was it reasonable to Chauvin, like what Chauvin actually thought about the situation, his subjective state of mind. It has to do with a reasonable officer in general, based on practices. Was the action reasonable given the context? So because courts want to defer to what officers say, they want to listen to police officers. People do this all the time in regular speech, right? It's like, well, I don't know, I guess I'll trust what the officer says. It is a dangerous job. All of these tropes out there. And all of that, judges and courts feel that too. And it's built, and more than that, it's built into the very doctrine. It's built into the constitutional doctrine. It's built into certain practices of, they try to avoid liability, like qualified immunity, which people have been hearing a lot about, which basically means that officers can be immune from a civil liability for work they carry out or behaviors they carry out in the line of duty. So all of this is the big
and I want you to put a pin there, because I want to make that connection to some of the police reform legislation that was passed last summer in response to George Floyd's death. But I really want to pick your brain on that. But I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm glad to come back to that. But I wanted to just start with hard it is to hold a police officer liable for anything.
That's right.
That's really critical for understanding what's happening in the Derek Chauvin trial, which is to say, the prosecution has been, there are 3 charges in the case. There's one for second degree murder, for unintentional second degree murder. And by that, it means so we call it felony murder. So in the committing of a third degree assault against George Floyd, the officer killed him. So it's not to say, oftentimes in a murder context, in first degree murder, that means that the person intended to commit a murder. And that's not what's at issue here. It's did Derek Chauvin intend to assault George Floyd? And that is what's at issue for the second degree murder charge. There's also a second degree manslaughter charge, I believe, and the third degree assault charge. So those are the three charges, and there are two kind of main issues that the defense has been trying to show. So first, it all goes back to this objective reasonableness standard. So the defense has been trying to show that the officer, given what he knew at the time, was behaving in a way that was reasonable. Now, the prosecution rolled out a bunch of people to say that this action was against training, it was against departmental policy, it's against national standards of police action, it's against everything that policing is about. Now, what's important about that is that Derek Chauvin is a maligned person, like not in support of anything about what Derek Chauvin is about.
That's a polite way of putting it. I respect that.
It's like, that's the best I can say, like in the context of a podcast. And it's like, so what the prosecution has tried to do is say that, yes, and what he was doing is not policing. Like, this is what you heard the prosecutor say over and over again throughout the trial, but, really drives it home in the closing arguments. This was not policing, it was assault. And also he made the point to say, what's on trial today is not policing, it's not the criminal justice system, it's Derek Chauvin and Derek Chauvin's behavior that is not policing. Now, the defense has made several different kinds of arguments that try to say, well, this officer, and officers are often confronted with situations where they can't figure out whether there's an actual threat. So people's behavior is unpredictable. So the fact that George Floyd, used some type of drugs at some point in the defense's mind becomes irrelevant. Now, as the prosecution said and pointed out, George Floyd was not resisting anything. Was laying on the pavement. He was before Derek Chauvin got put his knee on the neck and the back. George Floyd was complying, and to the extent he wasn't, it was because he was having an anxiety attack. So officers are supposed to be trained to notice signs of distress, and because of what George Floyd looked like and because of who they thought he was, they didn't they chose not to notice his signs of distress. They chose to believe that he was lying about being unable to breathe, that he was lying about his claustrophobia.
But can we unpack, you have two officers, literally the weight of two human beings. Oh, and then there was also a technique, forgive me for not knowing the technique, that he would apply pressure, and when the suspect or the victim complies, then the officer would then reward that victim with sort of the releasing of that pressure. That never happened. And so I'm trying to understand, as we continue to talk, like, when is enough? Like, what?
Yeah. Well, we'll be trying to figure that out forever. I think you're right. So George Floyd was lying prone. Mm-hmm. So Derek Chauvin put him into the prone position, and it's supposed to be that once the handcuffs are on and the situation seems to be safe, the officer is supposed to put the person, the arrestee, and on the side, so they can breathe. Now, I guess I will say, one of the things that really stands out to me about the case is that we're focusing very much on the moment of death, which I think is critical in a murder case, obviously. The prosecution spent a lot of time focusing on the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and the defense spent a lot of time focusing on everything else that was surrounding the situation. Now, but in a way to kind of say, well, the situation was hard to read. But what stands out to me is, the other pieces of the context leading up to George Floyd's death, including the fact that, the officers were called to deal with this counterfeit $20 bill situation. They arrive, tap on his window, and pull a gun on him immediately. He looks terrified. He looks horrified. That in itself is an undue act of violence, actually. It's legal. But no one understands that to be, that is not part of the discussion in terms of what an unreasonable use of force was in this case. So I guess what I want to say is important to keep in mind here. And actually, I want to say one other thing about the case. So the other issue that the defense is trying to bring up, of course, and I think a lot of people have been talking about this on social media, is to say that actually Chauvin wasn't the cause or wasn't a substantial factor, which is the element in George Floyd's death. So to say, he had heart disease, he used drugs even though the levels were not very high. It's like many people have heart disease.
Right. I just, oh God.
It's pretty wild. But that is what the defense would have to argue. I understand why they're arguing that.
So let me ask. Oh, well, no, you had one other thing you wanted to say.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna just move on to why didn't Chauvin testify? Do you think this was the best option for this type of trial? Was it to his benefit to not speak?
Yes. I think the defense attorney made a wise decision in having Derek Chauvin not testify. Now, is it the kind of cathartic decision? Did the public to have this cathartic moment of gazing upon Derek Chauvin and hear from him? No.
You're right. Right.
As a matter of legal strategy, it was completely right to not have him testify, because if he had testified, the cross-examination would have been brutal. And also, the Derek Chauvin is not like there is nothing about him that is appealing to most onlookers. He
is a typical white man.
I think beyond that, I think it's more than that. He never looks vaguely remorseful. Good point. The kind of dead look in his face that he had when he was on top of George Floyd is not dissimilar from the look that he has on his face when he's in the courtroom, when he's, he hasn't been unmasked very often. But, he wouldn't have been so the reason behind the reason that it would have been nice to have him testify theoretically would have been if he could have been seen as sympathetic or, initiated feelings of empathy from the jurors that are so small, and the chances of the really intense cross-examination were so certain that just wouldn't have been a wise calculation. And then also keep in mind that Derek Chauvin has a history of being forceful against people he's arresting. There's a New York Times story that catalogs about 6 people who have come out to say, to talk about their own experiences with Derek Chauvin. And in fact, one of them, a Black woman, he did the knee kneel on her too. So,
Wait, pause. So first of all, if y'all just joining us, we are inside the room with Dr. Bell. And we are just talking through the Chauvin trial. And We were supposed to take breaks, but I am just in this and we're just going right through. So thank you for joining us. So you mean to tell me that there are literally reports tracking this man's behavior and there's been no recourse, nothing. Just like he.
Yeah, so I can't say for sure that those were reports that, that there were official grievances. So some people in the story say, they wanted to file a grievance or file a suit, but they couldn't find a lawyer or, again, it is so hard to win against police that I think this is a message I want people to take away from this. So like, let's say Derek Chauvin is convicted. What will that mean for policing? I think not a lot. I think actually what it means is that it just kind of reinforces that killing someone in a public place in a very egregious way could get you in trouble. But remember what I was just saying, which is that like everything that led up to the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, which is appalling stuff. It was appalling the way George Floyd was treated before the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And nothing about those policies or practices is going to change as a consequence of Derek Chauvin's conviction if it happens. So I just want viewers to be aware of that.
Okay. So I understand the legal side of this conversation. The more practical side in me, which we don't live in a practical world, I guess, I'm having a hard time, and this is coming from a policymaker, right? And I have to deal with attorneys all day to really figure out what's the best course we should take to enforce, to support, to change, reform, all that good stuff when you talk about policy. I know last summer, my colleagues and I served as the immediate past president of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus here in the state of Connecticut. And we led the charge on the passage of the police accountability bill. And one of the major components within that bill was the qualified immunity piece that you talked or spoke of earlier. Do you think now is the time for us to revisit that section of the bill to strengthen a little more in response to this type of behavior? Or from your perspective, not much will change and the unions and everybody else would kind of, lawyer up and fight against what it is that we're trying to do?
Well, I think we lose the battles we don't fight, right? So I think
Indeed.
Trying to strengthen the bill and then like changes in qualified immunity, stuff like that is really important. The prospect of greater accountability is important. But we do need, and I hope some police departments and some political leaders putting pressure on police departments will see what I just said, which is that the situation was unjust, not just that one act. And I think, first of all, so there are all these ways in which police get to, so high crime areas, for example, police get to behave entirely differently in areas that are deemed high crime. And we know, though, because we know high crime in Connecticut means certain urban locations. It means Black and Puerto Rican areas. It means, it means areas that are poor or cut out of the economic structure. Like
That's right.
Going on, and so first of all, there has to be training around that. Like having officers have much more of a contextual understanding of kind of like what they're encountering when they say they're in a high crime area. That's really important. But I think there's something much bigger here. Because of the constitutional doctrine, there is, basically we have to have less policing of these areas in certain types of ways. Like policing itself has to be walked back. And we really need a ground level discussion about what it takes to make communities safe.
Dr. Bell, we've been talking about this since 1960s, and even before that, and policemen and women still treating Black and brown indigenous people like they're animals. When does this conversation take the right turn and we have a real, authentic, genuine sort of respect for each other? And maybe that's just a rhetorical question, and I struggle a great deal on this. Where do we go? Where do we go from here, right? And here's a question, and we can wrap up. I want to publicly invite you to sort of an after-hour Instagram live, because I think many of our millennials and those young people who are struggling with this trial and trying to figure out, number one, process what's happening, but then put that into action in a very productive way. So, during the trial, we can recount the untimely death of Philandro Castile, followed by George Floyd. And then we had the senseless death of the young man, Dante Wright, during yet another traffic stop in Minnesota. And there's like this national focus on Minnesota and highlighting the issues around systemic racial inequity, police, and justice throughout our country. How can we, as a nation, specifically Black folk and our allies, prepare for the civil unrest that will follow after the verdict is released? Like what should we be doing? Because they're already starting up. And I got to insert Congressman Maxine Waters. She made a comment, which I stand by. I don't see anything wrong with it, but they're making a big deal of about what she said, and they're saying that she's encouraging some violent sort of reactions to a verdict, whether it's good in our favor or not. Why would a sitting Congresswoman say such a thing? What are your thoughts on that? I know that's a twofer, but how should we prepare for some civil unrest?
Yeah, so I think the first, and this might, I think we should all be, to the extent we can, out there protesting and participating in direct action. I know the pandemic is still going, not everyone's vaccinated, but like, I don't know what do we mean by civil unrest, right? Like, so we need voices, we need protests. In fact, the only reason we are having our eyes turned on the Chauvin trial
because of it. Yeah. Yes.
Right. This is how change happens. And so this whole no unrest is necessary. Unrest has moved us forward at every step of the way. For Black people in particular, policy change seems to only happen when we are laying our bodies on the line. And so I admire the people who are out there doing the work. Now, of course, that doesn't have to mean, certain types of dangerous violence. That doesn't have to be doing property. Like, I'm not in favor of those things. Frankly, I think, and I think we saw this last summer, people who want to delegitimize the movement engaging in that type of behavior. So I think we prepare ourselves in a few ways. One, getting involved ourselves and being part of what kind of keeps the protest both lively and also maybe from escalating. Two, I think educating ourselves. Like, people need to know more about this history, about change and how it happens. Because I think a lot of this, like beating up on protesters and calling protesters thugs and all of this stuff, comes from a belief that real change only happens in a genteel way, when actually political will is built is often in ways that are not genteel. It's not respectable. So that's what I think. It's not really unlike what Congresswoman Waters was referring to, which is, recognizing this kind of. Okay, that was weird.
It's okay. Got a little music in the background. That's a little commercial. We're good.
But yeah, so I think, frankly, people, certain people who really believe in a type of gentility and civility politics love to use Congresswoman Waters as a foil to really beat up on truth-telling Black women. It's hard for me to take very seriously some of that, because it's a way of waving hands to distract from the actual injustice. And so that's why I'm turning my energy.
Well, first of all, do you have any community talks or a book that you want to share with us so that our followers can follow you on social media, purchase your material, attend your community talks? Like, the world probably already knows who Dr. Monica Bell is, but my goal is to get the masses, the world, to really hear what you have to say, and your passion and your commitment to all people, but our people. And I really, really appreciate your time coming inside the room today to help us better understand, not just emotionally, but to really understand what's at stake, and a call to action. So if you want to share with us your handle, if you're on Twitter, and a book, like I want to purchase your book if you have one, and anything else you wish to share with our followers.
Yeah, sure. So my book is still in progress. So I'll let you know about that when it comes, but my Twitter handle is Monica C. Bell. Very easy to find. Also, I have an Instagram at Law Prof Makeup, so Law Professor Makeup, and I have a website that's just monicabell.org. So I'm pretty easy to find online, and a lot of my talks and stuff are available through my Twitter account.
Sweet. Again, Dr. Bell, thank you so much for joining us. And again, y'all join me every Monday at 4 p.m. FubuRadio.com, on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram. Just join in. Until next time, peace, and I love you.